1942, two admirals go head-to-head in an epic battle that will decide who rules the Pacific Ocean. Japanese Admiral Chuichi Nagumo and US Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher are far apart on the battlefield, but in their minds they are standing over the same table. Now, two historians get inside the heads of Nagumo and Fletcher to unpick their tactics and strategy, their decisions, dilemmas, and disasters. A team of experts will weigh up their hardware, their technology, and their firepower to reveal just how the Battle of Midway was won. In May 1942, the mightiest battle fleet in the world set sail from Japan. Leading the charge is Admiral Chuichi Nagumo.
He's risen through the ranks because he's loyal, obedient, professionally competent, doesn't make mistakes. He's a man who does exactly what he's told. And this is the great success and also the great weakness.
Andrew Lambert, Professor of Naval History, will analyze Admiral Nagumo's part in the Battle of Midway.
He's not an original thinker, he's not flexible, he lacks the ability to see the other side of the issue, and he's knocked out of his stride quite easily by things that don't go according to plan.
Nagumo's mission is to destroy the United States Navy in a monumental showdown in the Pacific. For him, it's a matter of unfinished business. Only a few months earlier, Nagumo destroyed a huge part of the US Navy in Pearl Harbor. But he's still not entirely happy.
They hadn't finished the job. The Japanese hit the wrong targets, the battleships which the Americans couldn't use because they were too slow, and aircraft that the Americans could replace easily.
The targets Nagumo should have destroyed at Pearl Harbor were the US aircraft carriers, which happened to be out at sea during the attack.
When they discovered that none of the American carriers were in harbor, they were really quite put out, because that meant the Americans had a weapon to strike back.
For men like Nagumo, who are steeped in Bushido, the traditional Japanese way of the warrior, this is unacceptable.
In the samurai fighting technique, the emphasis is on striking killing blows. It's not an exchange of blows. You hit somebody and they're dead. This is why the Japanese use those fearsome two-handed swords and make sure that if you hit somebody, they're not going to hit back.
The Japanese hatch a plan to destroy the US fleet once and for all. And it all hinges on a heap of sand in the Pacific Ocean, midway between the two warring nations, the island of Midway. This seemingly insignificant dot on the map is an important American military outpost. It's a refueling stop for the US Navy in the Pacific War, and clearly a thorn in the Japanese side. The Japanese plan is to send a large battle fleet to invade Midway. Admiral Nagumo and his strike force of aircraft carriers will bomb the island to prepare for the Japanese invasion. This maneuver is designed to draw the American carriers away from the safety of Pearl Harbor and come to Midway's rescue. There, Nagumo's carriers will engage the Americans and soften them up. Then, the main body of Japanese battleships, lying in wait just over the horizon, will steam into the fray and finish off the US carriers with their powerful long-range weapons. The Japanese have planes that outrange any other plane. Their ships have heavy guns that can fire over the horizon, and they have the Long Lance, the most fearsome torpedo in the world. The Japanese have solved an age-old problem with torpedoes: bubbles. Conventional torpedoes are powered by a tank full of compressed air. But only 21% of that air, the oxygen, powers the engine. The rest of the air escapes in a trail of bubbles, which reveals the torpedo's position. The Japanese Long Lance torpedo has a tank full of pure oxygen, which burns without leaving a bubble trail, and it powers the torpedo over 40 kilometers across the sea towards the unsuspecting enemy. Equipped with such superior technologies and firepower, the Japanese Navy fears no enemy. Especially not the Americans, who lost most of their battleships at Pearl Harbor. The American admiral who is expected to fight the Japanese with just a handful of aircraft carriers is Frank Jack Fletcher.
The thing about Fletcher is he's normal. He's a guy. He enjoys a drink, which some historians seem to have slated him for. He is not a great thinker. He's not interested in his view, in his place in history.
Dr. Phillips O'Brien is an expert on American naval history. He will analyze the role of Admiral Fletcher in the Battle of Midway.
He's in a terribly difficult situation. Fletcher is in command at the time when you are always outnumbered. You have no battleships to speak of, and you have to therefore be far more concerned about the loss of units. If Fletcher loses just one carrier, and that's going to make a big difference, he would have done great damage to the American Navy.
As the Japanese fleet head for Midway, Admiral Nagumo is supremely confident of victory.
The Japanese have won every battle they fought for 6 months. They can't conceive of losing. They've beaten the Americans, they've beaten the British, there isn't anybody else. You know, they are the reigning champions. They've won all the latest engagements, and they'd be forgiven for thinking they were the best.
The battle for Midway seems a foregone conclusion for Nagumo. On paper, Fletcher doesn't stand a chance. When Admiral Fletcher is given the job of fighting the Japanese, he doesn't even have a ship. His carrier, the USS Yorktown, has been heavily damaged by Japanese bombs at the Battle of the Coral Sea, only 3 weeks before. Yorktown's hull was breached and she was taking in water fast. But then the American damage control team sprang into action. Defense analyst Professor Eric Grove has come to a Royal Navy battle simulator to study the techniques Fletcher's crew would have used. These Royal Navy sailors are running through a simulated rocket attack on their vessel. All they have to save their ship from sinking are some bits of wood and a hammer to plug the holes, and metal props to shore up the structure.
Hammering wood into a hole in the side of the ship to stop water coming in goes back to the earliest days of seafaring. It's a very proven technology.
Using these techniques, Fletcher's crew could deal with almost any damage the Japanese could dish out.
When the Yorktown's attacked at the Battle of the Coral Sea and quite seriously damaged, the damage control system goes into action. Fires are fought, leaks are stopped. The whole kind of activity that we've seen within a wider set, all the possible dangers to the ship are dealt with, and the ship is saved from damage that might well have sunk a Japanese ship.
Fletcher's crew were masters at damage control, quite unlike their Japanese opponents.
I think there's a basic cultural thing in the Japanese Navy. You know, you don't expect even to be hit. And when you're hit, well, you try and strike back. You don't try and sort of bind up your wound. Hence, it was left to the engineers, and therefore only a small fraction of the ship's company were even trained in it. So therefore there weren't enough people. And secondly, what people that were trained very much expected to be told what to do from the top. Nothing could have been more different in the US Navy, where small teams, non-commissioned officers in charge, even perhaps other seamen, a much greater ability, shall we say, organically to cope with this kind of threat. More people trained, more people available, and the damage control therefore works. And American ships, such as the USS Yorktown, proved quite hard to sink.
Fletcher takes the heavily damaged Yorktown back to Pearl Harbor to be repaired. It looks like she'll be out of action for weeks, which means that Fletcher will have to face Nagumo's 4 carriers at Midway with only 2 carriers of his own. Fletcher simply can't afford to leave the Yorktown behind. So the sheer might of American industrial power brings Fletcher's ship back to life in only 24 hours. 1,400 men descend on Yorktown and work round the clock to get her ready for battle once more.
The repair of the Yorktown is the single most important repair job in the Second World War. There's no other dramatic, massive repair job where a major element of warfare is fixed so quickly at such a decisive time.
Fletcher now has 1 extra carrier to throw into battle. And he has a crew that knows how to fix a broken ship, which will give him a big advantage in the battle to come. But by far the biggest ace in Fletcher's hand is a 44-year-old mathematician called Joseph Rochefort.
He was sloppy in his dress. He was not spit-shine. He would have driven, there's certain admirals he would have driven crazy.
Commander Rochefort and his team of codebreakers are the unsung heroes of the Pacific War. For months, Rochefort's team have been working flat out, monitoring Japanese radio traffic. His mathematicians have deciphered part of the Japanese Navy code and can read about 15% of each message. They learn from these fragments that the Japanese are about to attack a target codenamed AF. Rochefort suspects this stands for Midway, but he can't be sure. So he lays a trap to get the answer directly from the Japanese. Now that Fletcher knows where the Japanese are going to strike, he can move quickly to ambush them. Fletcher heads for a spot in the open ocean, about 600 kilometers northeast of Midway, which the Americans christen Point Luck.
Point Luck was perfectly located. It's basically to the north and to the east of Midway. The Japanese are going to be coming from the north and the west, so they will be in range of Midway and discovered by the Americans before they could discover where the American Navy was. And that's a great ace in the hole for the American fleet.
Midway Island has scouting planes with large fuel tanks, which gives them extra range to spot Nagumo's approaching fleet. Once Fletcher knows where the Japanese are, his plan will kick into action. He will delay his attack on Nagumo until the Japanese planes have bombed Midway and the island has soaked up the attack.
You let Midway, in a sense, do the dirty work. And of course, it works out very well. You let the Japanese launch their assault on Midway and have done their big assault in the day, and they have to go back and they have to rearm and recruit before they can do another one. And that's the time when you catch them. So it makes a lot more sense to wait and let the Japanese show their hand.
Midway gives Fletcher a big advantage. The island becomes his 4th aircraft carrier. From here, he will launch his first attack on the Japanese. In complete secrecy, the Americans fly in nearly 100 extra combat aircraft to strengthen Midway's attack force. The trap is set. At 0430 hours on June the 4th, Nagumo's ships are in range of Midway. Certain to have the element of surprise on his side, he dispatches only a small search party to check for enemy ships.
And of course, Nagumo isn't expecting to spot the Americans. He sent a search out to make sure they're not there, to confirm their absence, which is the plan. The plan is they come tomorrow or the day after. They're not coming today.
Nagumo sends only 7 scout planes to cover nearly 500,000 square kilometers of open ocean. Each plane has to search an area 3 times the size of Wales. And sure enough, the Japanese scouts failed to spot the American carriers lying in wait. Nagumo's shoddy scouting costs him valuable time in a battle where every minute counts.
The Japanese were hyper-aggressive, and as such they almost believed scouting was a bit soft. You launched, you attacked, that's what you did. The United States put a lot of effort into search operations to find out where the Japanese Navy was. And this is one of the areas you might say is a crucial advantage.
Fletcher sends out 4 times more scout planes than Nagumo. Midway alone launches 22 flying boats. Together, these ultra-long-range aircraft cover an area 5 times larger than the Japanese planes. But the American planes are much closer together than the Japanese, which gives them more chance of success. Fletcher's thorough search plan pays off. At 0530 hours on June the 4th, an American scout comes on the radio with an electrifying message. He has sighted Nagumo's carriers. The Americans wait until the massive wave of bombers from the Japanese carriers enters Midway's radar zone. Then, they launch every single one of their planes from the island. Unexpectedly for the Japanese, most of the American pilots don't engage them, but head straight for the Japanese carriers. The tables are turned. The ambusher is about to be ambushed. But as the American torpedo bombers move in on Nagumo's carriers, it becomes obvious that the mission is doomed to fail. The green American pilots are no match for the battle-hardened Japanese flyers.
Being in an American torpedo plane must have been the most devastating, because you have to do this run. If you're going to launch a torpedo, you have to go to low level, very visible, come down, make a run towards a Japanese ship, and you're leaving yourself absolutely exposed to these brilliant Japanese fighters, and most of them at Midway paid the penalty for that.
The Japanese fighters shoot down all but 3 of the American torpedo bombers. Not a single torpedo hits home. To Nagumo, the Americans look like a complete pushover.
Which only fills him with an increased sense of confidence. If this is the best they've got, we're home free. They're throwing lots of ammunition at us, but they're not hitting. We're cutting their planes down. Our fighters are doing a brilliant job. It looks good.
But Nagumo's attack on Midway isn't going quite to plan. His bombers are supposed to destroy the island's defenses and prepare for the invasion. But the Americans are expecting them. As the Japanese bombers attack, they take heavy losses from Midway's anti-aircraft fire.
Nagumo's problem is that from the start it becomes quite clear that the Americans are ready. They seem to be absolutely up for this. They're not half asleep like they were at Pearl Harbor.
And just like at Pearl Harbor, Nagumo's forces can't finish the job. They do not manage to knock out Midway's defenses.
And the strike leader, Tomonaga, radios back to say, look, we're going to have to do this again. We've got air superiority, we're going to have to go back again and give them a real workover. And that's going to mean using heavy, high-explosive bombs on his torpedo bombers.
Nagumo is loading his planes with runway-busting bombs to attack Midway again when he receives shattering news over the radio. A scout plane has spotted a US carrier only about 400 kilometers away. Nagumo doesn't understand. He assumed the carriers were still in Pearl Harbor. This is not going to plan.
One tiny little radio message and the world turns upside down.
Nagumo now has to abandon Midway and attack the enemy carrier before it attacks him. But that means he has to make a difficult choice. He could attack the American carrier immediately, but most of his planes are loaded with the wrong munitions. Or he could rearm his planes with torpedoes, the weapon of choice for an attack on aircraft carriers, but this will take at least 60 minutes, time he may not have.
He's now in a place he doesn't want to be. He's in a place where he has to make a decision which is not part of the plan. He's got to do something off the cuff. He's got to be flexible, he's got to be fast, he's got to be decisive. And he's getting different inputs. His air experts, his air chief of staff and his other air officers are telling him things. And the information is starting to overload. His second in command is saying, we've got to go now, attack now, whatever we got, go now. And Nagumo says, no, we'll do it properly.
Nagumo follows standard protocol and gives the order to take the bombs off his planes and replace them with torpedoes. This is a fatal decision. Naval historian Professor Eric Grove has analyzed this critical moment in the Battle of Midway.
The Japanese have to reconfigure their airstrike from an anti-land strike to an anti-ship strike. That means that all the aircraft have to be struck down into the hangar here and have all their armament replaced. And of course, to increase the speed of this, the Japanese hangar crews take the bombs off the aircraft, pile them up in the sides of the hangar, bring up the new armament, attach it to the aircraft. But the problem was, that meant that he would have in his hangars a large number of rearmed aircraft together with a lot of the old ammunition.
And right next to this powder keg on each of Nagumo's carriers sit 500,000 litres of a highly flammable liquid, the fuel for the aeroplanes.
The way navies operated their aeroplanes in this period would make modern naval personnel go grey. The fuel itself, highly dangerous, highly volatile. We wouldn't dream of using it on board a modern warship. Nowadays, a different fuel is used, basically paraffin, much sort of lower burning point.
Until Nagumo can get his bombers out of the hangars and into the air, he is sitting on a floating bomb. And just as he prepares to bring his planes up onto deck, Fletcher's attack wave approaches from the east. Unlike the American carriers, Nagumo's ship is not equipped with radar to give him an early warning.
The Japanese do not have radar. They do not have the ability to see American planes before they physically can from either a spotter plane or even on deck on a ship, and that's an extraordinary weakness.
There couldn't be a worse moment for Nagumo to be attacked. Now he needs his flight decks to send up fighters and defend his ships, so his fully armed bombers are trapped in the hangars. This is exactly what Fletcher wanted. Now it's his turn to dish out some damage. If just one of his planes can score a hit on Nagumo's ships with their hangars full of bombs and fueled up planes, he will blow them to smithereens. But as Fletcher's bombers approach Nagumo's fleet, they get separated from their fighter escort and are now completely unprotected. Undeterred, they start their attack runs and become sitting ducks for the Japanese fighters.
They were all shot down. I mean, the torpedo bombers have the worst day of anyone, and they simply get massacred because they're so slow. They're incredibly brave, the pilots, who are able to sit there chugging along towards the Japanese while brilliant Japanese fighter pilots in Zeros just gun them down. But they make no impact on the Japanese Navy. They aren't able to destroy a single ship.
The Americans have squandered their advantage. Now it's Nagumo's turn to attack. He turns into the wind and prepares to launch his strike planes. All he needs is 45 minutes to get his bombers out of the hangars and into the air. "90 minutes after launching the doomed torpedo bombers, Admiral Fletcher fires off his second wave. The attack is led by 17 dive bombers, each carrying a 1,000-pound payload. And this time, Fletcher's fighters stay close to the bombers they're supposed to defend. They will now face Nagumo's fearless pilots in their lightning-fast Zero fighters.
The Americans had one problem with fighters. Their fighters weren't as good as Japanese fighters. The Zero was an absolutely brilliant fighter. I mean, typical Japanese, like their carriers, it packed a great punch. When it had that 20-millimeter cannon working, the Zero was just an absolutely wonderful fighter. The American fighter, the Wildcat, was a bit redoubtable, slower, a bit sturdier, could take a hit more, but it couldn't maneuver and certainly couldn't pack the kind of punch that the Zero could.
As Fletcher's 6 Wildcats approach the Japanese fleet, as many as 20 of Nagumo's Zeros pounce on them. It looks like the American fighters will get slaughtered. But the mighty Zero has a weak spot, as explosives engineer Sidney Alford will demonstrate.
We are here representing the Second World War Japanese fighter aircraft. The plastic container represents its fuel tank. It's got some petrol in it. I'm about to shoot an airgun pellet at it, but an explosive one. So, we'll see what happens. Well, that ignited it. Would you like to be in an airplane whose fuel tank is behaving like that?
The petrol vapor in Japanese fuel tanks is highly explosive, and a single hit can bring down a plane.
This is the fuel tank, I would say, of an offensive weapon, i.e. a fighter. Safety is not the primary consideration. Lightness, speed, firepower, and above all bravery of the pilot are what count from the Japanese mind of that period.
The Americans have a very different philosophy. Their fighters are designed with safety in mind. They are heavily armored and have a simple device to protect their pilots from a fiery end. Their fuel tanks are lined with a rubber bladder. As the tank empties, the bladder collapses, keeping close contact with the fuel. No explosive petrol vapor can build up inside the tank. This makes an American fuel tank much harder to ignite than a Japanese tank. The man who will exploit this advantage in the Battle of Midway is Fighter Commander Jimmy Thatch. In the dogfights over the Japanese carriers, the Zeros threaten to annihilate his Wildcats, but he gives them a run for their money. Thatch orders his fighters to break formation and fly in pairs spaced further apart. One Wildcat acts as the bait, allowing a Japanese Zero to get on its tail, soaking up its fire. Now both US pilots bank towards each other. Then they immediately weave back the other way. This maneuver puts the Zero directly into the sights of the second Wildcat. This is the Thatch weave. It's a complete shock to the Zeros.
And the Japanese have a great deal of difficulty adjusting to it, because it's the first time it's used as the Battle of Midway effectively.
In the next few minutes, Thatch and his wingman give the Japanese pilots a taste of their own medicine. They destroy 4 Zeros and draw the others away from the American dive bombers.
The Japanese Zeros get running combat air patrol, seem to get so frustrated fighting Thatch that they commit too many planes. That they're not looking for the dive bombers, they're fighting this small number of Wildcats that are just sitting there confusing them by the Thatch weave.
Now, Fletcher's dive bombers have a clear run at Nagumo's fleet. The American pilots take their aircraft to the limit. They come screaming towards Nagumo's carriers at insanely steep angles.
As soon as they open their attack, the Japanese know they've got a very serious problem, because the air operators on the 4 carriers can see that these are not novice pilots. These are not the amateurs who have been flying from Midway doing their best. These are the professionals.
Nagumo can only watch helplessly as the attack unfolds. 4 bombs slam into the first carrier, the Kaga. Her bridge is blown off, and she is out of action in seconds. Then, a minute later, the Soryu is hit.
The Japanese are looking up to the heavens. They can see the bombs being released. It's all in slow motion. It has that terrible inevitability about it. This is going to be a very bad day.
Nagumo's ship, the Akagi, and one other surviving carrier struggle to get away.
The Japanese are not moving in small, fast, agile ships. The Akagi is 42,000 tons. It takes an awful lot to change course, even at 28 knots. You're going to have to move a lot of water to conduct evasive maneuvers, and against a plane as agile as the American Dauntless dive bomber, they're just not going to be able to get out of the way.
As Nagumo is trying to escape, 3 Dauntless dive bombers are hot on his tail, led by ace pilot Dick Best.
Best was known to be extraordinarily accurate, and the Japanese said that they were incredibly impressed by his ability to use the clouds behind to hide his dive. That again, an inexperienced dive bomber just sees the target, sort of goes and hits it, and doesn't perhaps position themselves as well as they should.
While Nagumo is still gazing at the burning hulks of Kaga and Soryu, Best and his wingmen attack his ship. The first bomb misses by a few meters. Then Commander Dick Best releases his.
Only one bomb hits it, but it hits it in the heart. You couldn't have put this one bomb in a more devastating place.
Best's bomb crashes into Nagumo's hangar, which is crammed with fueled-up planes and high explosives.
So you've got both the anti-ship armament under the aeroplanes and the anti-Midway armament along the sides of the hangar. In come the American bombs. Chaos. This area inside the Japanese carriers was absolutely devastated. I think in one of the Japanese carriers, some 269 or so of her air mechanics just disappeared. They were incinerated.
Everything is just gone. All the people you need to do things are dead or wounded. All the systems you need to operate have been broken. These ships just cannot take a hit.
Within 5 minutes, 3 of Nagumo's 4 carriers are burning wrecks.
As soon as the dust had settled and the smoke had cleared, Nagumo would have been absolutely suicidal. His command had evaporated in front of him. He wouldn't have needed anybody to tell him those 3 ships were dead. He would have to abandon the flagship that he'd served on all the way through from Pearl Harbor. It's been the talisman of victory, the iconic vessel of the Japanese Navy, and it's been reduced to matchwood under him. It really was a terrible moment. The bottom had dropped out of his world.
Nagumo is forced to abandon ship and transfer to a battle cruiser. But in his mind, he is still in the same place, facing his nemesis across the same battle plan.
You would imagine that Nagumo, having seen 3 of his carriers knocked out, only got 1 left, you'd think he'd say, well, okay, that's enough for one day, let's get out of here before something worse happens. Not a bit of it. They press on. They carry on heading towards the Americans. They're not going to stop, because Nagumo doesn't have an order to withdraw. He's pressing on after the enemy. He's going for broke.
Nagumo has only 1 carrier left, the Hiryu. But she still carries a powerful strike force. And now, for the first time that day, Nagumo gets the chance to strike at the American carriers. One of his scout planes spots Fletcher's ship, the Yorktown. Nagumo doesn't hesitate. Hiryu attacks. When his pilots arrive over Yorktown, they are met with a hail of anti-aircraft fire. 13 of the 18 Japanese dive bombers get shot out of the sky. But the remaining pilots now show their deadly skill. They break through and score 3 perfect hits on Yorktown. Fletcher's ship is now spewing smoke and flames. It looks like she's doomed. But the Americans will not abandon her without a fight.
Unlike the Japanese, the Yorktown had experience of being attacked a few days before, virtually, at the Battle of the Coral Sea. So therefore, the Yorktown knew what to do: get rid of as much inflammable material as possible. A petrol tanker was unceremoniously dumped over the side.
And then Fletcher's crew saved their burning ship with simple chemistry. Dr. Andrew Shidlow explains how they did it.
Fuel fires are very difficult to put out because they will cause water to turn to steam if water is used. The steam expands enormously and ends up in a huge fireball. So water is completely useless and ineffective as an extinguisher for fuel fires. However, in this container here, I have a substance which is used professionally for firefighting, and I'll now demonstrate it too. And as you see, it's an invisible substance. And there we go. The substance, of course, is carbon dioxide, an invisible gas which is denser than air, heavier than air, and it causes the fires to go out by excluding oxygen. It sinks over the flame and thereby pushes the oxygen away. Once the oxygen is gone, the flames can no longer burn and the fire is extinguished.
Carbon dioxide becomes a key ingredient in the Battle of Midway.
When the Americans in Yorktown knew an attack was coming in, they flooded their fuel system with carbon dioxide gas. When you flood the fuel system with carbon dioxide, you effectively stop it going off. The fuel could not ignite. It's quite possible that if the Americans on Yorktown had not done that, then she might have suffered the same fate as the Japanese aircraft carrier.
A single bomb destroyed Nagumo's ship. Fletcher's ship has taken 3 hits and looks like she will survive. Convinced he's sunk Yorktown, Nagumo turns his attention to the other two US carriers. But he's slowly running out of aeroplanes.
By this stage they've got some torpedo bombers ready, not many, but some, so they can do a proper Japanese attack, but in a very small scale. Not 120 planes, but 15.
The leader of this motley crew is one of Nagumo's best pilots, Joichi Tomonaga. His torpedo bomber was machine-gunned over Midway and has only just been patched up.
Just as he gets in and fires the engine up, one of the wing petrol tanks gives way, all the petrol comes out, and he knows that he's on a one-way trip. His squadron mates say, no, you must fly one of the undamaged planes, but he insists that he will lead the strike from his plane, even though he's not coming back. The classic Japanese attitude, it's my duty, I know the equipment has let me down, I'll go and do my duty anyway.
By fluke, Tomonaga leads his flight straight to Yorktown.
By this stage, the Americans have mended Yorktown. She's steaming at good speed, she's operating aircraft, she doesn't seem to be in the least damaged, there's no smoke, and she's on an even keel.
As Yorktown looks undamaged, Tomonaga mistakes her for another US carrier and attacks. But suddenly, out of nowhere, a US fighter appears, Jimmy Thatch in his Wildcat. He rakes Tomonaga's plane with his machine guns. But Tomonaga keeps his burning plane level and manages to launch his torpedo. Then he crashes just meters from the ship. Tomonaga's torpedo misses, but two others slam into the side of the Yorktown and leave her dead in the water. The Japanese pilots believe they have sunk a second American carrier, which makes Nagumo think there's only one left, and the odds are now even.
They're really on a roll now. They're coming from absolutely nowhere. They've just got it back. They're on the brink of success.
But in reality, the Japanese have wasted their precious torpedoes on a dying ship. A mistake that will cost Nagumo dearly. On the afternoon of the 4th of June 1942, Admiral Fletcher is forced to abandon the USS Yorktown.
Well, the great thing is the difference between the Japanese admirals and Fletcher at this time. The Japanese admirals, some of them go down with their ships and histrionics, others must be begged to leave. From what we can tell, it's an example of Fletcher, the unassuming man. Fletcher looks at the ship, can conduct operations, time to go. No great drama, doesn't seem to be psychologically scarred, doesn't have regrets later in his life, can't fight from the Yorktown, let's go.
But Yorktown has a final card to play. Before he leaves, Fletcher launches one last squadron of scout planes to look for the last of Nagumo's carriers. For 3 hours, the American planes scour the ocean before they run short of fuel and have to turn back. Then suddenly, one of the pilots strikes pay dirt. He spots the Hiryu. This is the signal for the Americans to launch their bombers. Once again, they catch Nagumo's men off guard. Famished after 12 hours of constant fighting, the pilots are eating dinner.
The pilots are down in the mess hall just finishing their meal when dive bombers arrive overhead and conduct a second textbook dive bombing attack.
The Hiryu maneuvers violently to dodge the attack, but to no avail. 4 American bombs find their aim and devastate the last of Nagumo's carriers.
The Japanese are completely defeated. There are now 4 very big bonfires just off the coast of Midway, and you can see them from a long way off. Thick pools of oily petrol smoke from these wrecked and burning ships. The Japanese had lost 4 of their 6 fast strike carriers. They'd lost not too many pilots. The men they'd lost who mattered were the maintenance crews on those hangar decks, the men who prepared those planes. Those are the guys who got killed when the bombs hit the hangars, not the pilots, the mechanics. They couldn't replace those guys.
4,800 of Nagumo's men are dead. 275 precious planes destroyed.
Nagumo has to face up to the most appalling moment. He's lost the elite force that's won the Japanese all their great victories so far. The heroes of Pearl Harbor, it's all gone, it's finished. He's lost the Emperor's ships. He's got to explain this to the Emperor.
Nagumo has lost more than a battle. His defeat costs Japan the supremacy in the Pacific and shifts the American war machine into overdrive.
The Americans just keep on building more carriers, producing more planes, putting more pilots in the sky. The Japanese cannot win. No amount of skill makes up for the enormous difference in industrial and economic power.
The Americans lose 307 men at Midway, but their sacrifice is not in vain.
Winning the Battle of Midway allowed the Americans to reach Japan at least a year before they would have otherwise, and in doing so saved hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives on both sides.
Admiral Fletcher picks up another command and carries on fighting the Japanese. Admiral Nagumo is relieved of his command a few months after the defeat at Midway, and when he's finally forced to surrender to the Americans, he takes his own life.